when we first embarked on looking seriously at this Red Sea region 3.5, 4 years ago or so at USIP, we were consulting with a number of folks around Washington, and somebody who had not spent, another scholar who had not spent much time thinking about the Horn of Africa, had just come back from a trip to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And he said, when we were talking, he was really struck by the fact that they had a meeting with some very senior Saudi officials. And the only thing they wanted to talk about was not Iran. It wasn't even Yemen, for maybe perhaps obvious reasons. It wasn't Lebanon. They wanted to talk about the Horn of Africa. And I think we do ourselves as the United States a disservice for underappreciating the priorities that some of the Middle Eastern actors actually put on this region. Because, as I said earlier, we tend to think about it in policymaking circles as sort of an afterthought. And truly it's become, I think, anything but.
Since the time of ancient Egypt, the Red Sea has been vital for global trade. Once home to the spice trade, the Red Sea now has millions of barrels of oil a day transported across its waters, and a lot underneath and nearby too. With China, France, Italy, and the US now building large ports and also military bases in the region, what does the future of the Red Sea look like? How important is its security for global security? Can the region be a place of global cooperation? These are some of the questions we'll address in tonight's Great Decisions program's Red Sea Security. I'm Mary Eintema, World Boston's president and CEO. As you may know, World Boston's mission is to foster engagement in international affairs and global cooperation. Even though we're at home, we strongly believe that though our programs may change from their original in-person setting, this mission must persist. And now, at long last, I'm pleased to introduce you to our speakers and moderator. Peyton Knopf is a senior advisor to the Africa program at the United States Institute of Peace, or USIP, where his work focuses on the political, economic, and security dynamics of the Red Sea. He is also an advisor to the European Institute of Peace. Peyton is a US diplomat with expertise in sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. Dr. Karen Young is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where she studies the political economy of the Middle East with a special focus on the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. She regularly teaches at the Foreign Service Institute and has taught at George Washington University and Johns Hopkins SAIS. Ambassador Robert Loftus is a former 32-year Foreign Service officer who served in Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Oceania, including as ambassador to the Kingdom of Lesotho. So let's get right to it. Go right ahead, Bob, Karen, and Peyton.
Peyton, let me turn over to you and talk about some of the options for the United States in dealing with this rather complex area.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to World Boston for having me as a alumni of Boston University. I'm particularly delighted to be with you all. First, let me just say that for those who are not familiar with the U.S. Institute of Peace, it was founded by Congress in 1984 and is dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. And it's very much with that mission in mind that we came to what I'm going to speak about in a moment, which is what we call a senior study group on peace and security in the Red Sea, and very much taking on board and inspired by, in fact, what Karen has just said, which is the sort of re-energized geostrategic significance of the Red Sea area. The number of U.S. interests that are at stake there, and the fact that the region has fundamentally been transformed in the last number of years. And unfortunately, U.S. strategy had not kept pace with that transformation. So at USIP, we convened a group of about a dozen former senior U.S. officials to sort of rethink U.S. strategy in this region. And our starting point was very much along the lines of what Karen has suggested, that the Horn of Africa has become increasingly an integral part of the security systems of the Middle East, of the Indo-Pacific, and of the Mediterranean in a way that wasn't true 5 or even 10 years ago. And that the strategic importance and the competition for influence over this space and the dependence upon which both states on either side of the Red Sea, but states much further afield, depend on it for trade and transit had really changed the geopolitical landscape. And as a result, the dynamics in the Horn of Africa, which had long been seen as sort of backwater, disconnected from the Middle East, are now not only shaped by the Middle East and by other regions, but also have a direct impact on the security and economic and political interests of Middle Eastern actors. And then, as Karen quite rightly said, of the United States and some of our allies and partners in Europe. So in the course of the senior study group effort, which I should say the final report was released at the end of October, and it can be found on USIP's website, usip.org. We identified a number of sort of core trends, and let me just highlight those briefly, and then I'll sort of run through the policy recommendations before we turn to the discussion. The first sort of significant policy trend that we developed the recommendations to respond to was the destabilizing influence of Middle Eastern rivalries being exported into the Horn of Africa, and I hope we have the opportunity to discuss that a little bit further on in the discussion. The second important trend were the historic political transitions that were underway in Ethiopia and Sudan. In Ethiopia's case, starting in 2018, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power, and Sudan's case in 2019, when the longtime dictator of Sudan was deposed in a military coup. The third major trend was demography, and the fact that the population of the Horn of Africa is projected to grow by 44% in the next 15 years and by 87% in the next 30. So you have an entirely new generation of individuals coming, having a political awakening, and that's fundamentally changing, of course, the politics there. And then, as I said, the last point was the absence or the inability of US policy to sort of keep pace with the scope of change. So Elise, if you could maybe put up the slide of recommendations, and I'll just sort of run through the basket of those. Thank you very much. We identified sort of 4 categories or pillars, as we call it here, that could constitute a new US strategy in this region that was more fit for purpose, both in terms of advancing and defending US interests, but also in promoting greater stability in this region that has long, unfortunately, been racked by a number of conflicts and civil wars. And the first recommendation was for the United States to develop a political and diplomatic strategy to inoculate the Horn of Africa from the kinds of rivalries that I alluded to earlier among and between Middle Eastern actors. And I think here, Libya, for example, was a cautionary tale. It's a bit further north, of course, not directly on the Red Sea, but you have seen really in the last number of years, the significant fallout of a conflict being internationalized by a number of Middle Eastern states, and the devastating consequences, not just for the people of Libya, but regionally. And so the point here was to urge now the Biden administration to undertake an effort to inoculate the Horn from a similar catastrophe. The second sort of pillar was about structural reforms. And I think, as hopefully I made clear a few minutes ago, one of the things that has impeded, at least in the study group's view, more effective diplomacy in this region has been that the Horn of Africa and the Middle East have been considered as disconnected geostrategic spheres, and that has been reflected in the institutions of the foreign policy bureaucracy of the United States. And so we delineated a number of recommendations about how to bridge what we call the seams between Africa and the Middle East, where you have people who are responsible for Africa, you have people who are responsible for the Middle East, and in this sort of trans-regional space, there's much more. There's a great need for more coordination and coherence across U.S. diplomatic, security, and certainly development and humanitarian engagements. Further to that point, the third pillar was about how to realign U.S. development, humanitarian, and security assistance in this region, and particularly in light of the transitions that I mentioned earlier, and both the opportunities they present for true reform and really transformational change in the Horn of Africa, but also the risks. To focus U.S. assistance, both in recognition of the trans-regional nature of the space, but also on the importance of inclusive and legitimate governance. And again, I hope we can talk a little bit more about this in the discussion. And then the fourth and final pillar was really a call for active engagement by Congress. And I think we've been pleasantly encouraged, actually, from the response that we've received from a number of members of Congress and their offices about this since the report was released. And you do, of course, have constituencies that are deeply engaged in the Horn of Africa and the broader Red Sea region. And so what we tried to spell out in the report was how these constituencies could be harnessed, again, in recognition of some of the challenges and opportunities, but in a way that does more effectively bring the U.S. comparative advantage to bear in this region to mitigate volatility and increase prosperity. And let me just, if I may, conclude by maybe just giving an illustrative example of how some of these maybe potentially abstract concepts play out in the real world. I think as folks are very likely aware, unfortunately in early November, a fairly devastating conflict has broken out in Ethiopia. And while it looks on the surface to be an internal conflict, it's actually very reflective of a number of the dynamics that we're talking about today. And I'll just highlight one of those now as an example. You have two rivals, Ethiopia and Eritrea, who had long been rivals, who have now basically pursuing similar aims with the support of the United Arab Emirates. And that has really led to a complete realignment of the different alliances in this region. For example, while Egypt and Ethiopia have long been at loggerheads, and until recently, Egypt had counted on Eritrea as an ally in that regard. And of course, Egypt has a very close relationship with the UAE. Just in the last 8 weeks, that really has changed, as you have seen Eritrea and Ethiopia see more common interests. And that has really shaken up kind of the dynamic in the region, where you see Egypt sort of looking around for new partners, not feeling quite as comfortable with its own strategic positioning, being very concerned about the Nile and the share of water resources because of the construction that Ethiopia has made of a large dam on the Nile. And so it has set off sort of chain reaction of different states in the shared Red Sea region, kind of recalculating who their partners and allies are. And one of the interesting things about this region is while it is very rivalrous and very competitive, as we've said, most of the major actors are all security partners of the United States. So the most destabilizing sort of influences in this conflict-prone region are not, for example, China and Russia. It is the competition among the various states in the region that result in this volatility. And again, all of whom, by and large, with a few exceptions, have very close relationships with the United States, which presents both an opportunity for us to use our leverage to stabilize the region, but also puts us in a somewhat difficult position of balancing among a number of actors. So I'll stop there and very much look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks very much. Karen, I'd like to come back to you a little bit because Peyton raised a number of issues that it's really kind of important to understand where particularly the Gulf states are coming from. So when you were talking about looking at the Horn in this area as being rife for sort of commercial penetration, if I could use that term. Maybe talk a little bit about what some of the key players are looking to achieve, where they're trying to expend their influence and how they're going about doing that. I mean, I don't look at, say, Saudi Arabia or the Emiratis as being, major producers of consumer goods, but how else are they going in there? What are they bringing to the table that would give them more influence in that area, and in a way would both offer an opportunity for cooperation and brings the risk of confrontation with it?
Sure. Well, thanks. And I'll share some charts in a few minutes in terms of foreign direct investment from some of these external actors into the Horn. But you're right. the Gulf Arab states aren't necessarily producers of many consumer products, but they're producers of the things that go in just about every consumer product. And so, you know, the petrochemical capability, everything that we use that is made out of plastic started as oil in the ground. And so that is a market that matters to them. But there are other means of foreign economic policy and intervention, which the Gulf states are becoming quite good at. So foreign direct investment is one, both through private entities and through many of the state-owned entities and state assets and sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf is one means of intervention. But another is just a blanket state-to-state financial support. And this has been done mainly through deposits in central banks. So what this does in a place like Sudan or Ethiopia, a $3 billion deposit in a central bank is a way to shore up the value of the national currency. It allows the government some flexibility in terms of its balance of payments and its current account. And this has been very, very effective. They also do it in terms of aid, traditional humanitarian aid, and in goods aid, right? So not cash, but aid in kind. And they do this usually with oil and gas transfers. So these are countries that need energy products. And so a delivery of oil that can be used for to fuel the powering an electricity facility, a utility plant, is very welcome. Let me just share a little bit of data with you, which I think will be useful. Here's just a map just of some of those different commercial versus military facilities in the region. This is an International Crisis Group visual. But I think it gives you a sense of not just the Red Sea corridor, but the surrounding area, and also why the Indian Ocean and what goes up through the Persian Gulf and then to West Asia is so important. These things are all very much connected. And on the Saudi side, you'll see the development of a number of facilities, NEOM being the big tourism development that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is hoping to make. But facilities like Yanbu and Diba, which are more about, and Jizan, more about the export of oil. And then let's look at just some of the financials. So a place like Djibouti, where we have a lot of international actors, there has been this very strong intervention and financial investment from the GCC, almost entirely made up by the United Arab Emirates. And this was an investment in the port of Dorali, which then the Djibouti government nationalized in 2018 and really sort of kicked out Dubai Ports World, which has been operating that facility. But you see how the rise of the GCC states as really rivaling the investment capacity of much larger entities, the combined forces of the EU, the UK, and the US, and even China in a tiny place like Djibouti. In Egypt, the Gulf states have been very, very active as a source of foreign direct investment since 2011 and competing with each other. So between 2011 and 2013, Qatar was a major force of FDI into Egypt. After General Sisi came to power and Mohamed Morsi was defeated in a coup, you see more support from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait. But all the same, about $80 billion has gone into Egypt since 2011 in terms of foreign direct investment, contracting, central bank deposits, guarantees of multilateral lending facilities in coordination with the IMF, which are not captured on this chart. So just the enormous financial influence there. And you can see how some of the timing is varied. So for example, China is important in Egypt, but there have been spikes. And so the overall picture, if you're looking at a decade long from 2010 to this data is current to the end of 2020, it's actually the GCC states which become more important of a force. The same is true in Ethiopia, where the timing really matters. So as Peyton mentioned, in 2018, the United States really saw an opportunity in the liberalization of Ethiopia, the opening up of Ethiopia, both in terms of its political system and in terms of its economy. Ethiopia's economy is quite closed and very difficult. It's a very closed banking system. It's hard to get money in and out of the country. But the US made a big push in that period. It's since declined. But the GCC in many ways rivals what the Chinese have been trying to do in Ethiopia as well. So here's just a little graphic representation of that timing. That brown spike is the US, really led by the US, but also the Europeans and the Brits in that period between 2017 and 2019 of financial direct investment into Ethiopia. That's since declined. And as Peyton said, right now the situation is even more unstable. And the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, see this as an opportunity to gain political and financial footholds. Turkey is an important actor here too, and I don't have Turkey's data on my charts, but that's something to watch. And that's part of that ideological competition. The Turks and the Qataris on one side, the Emiratis, the Saudis on the other. And that's a battle about the role of political Islam in associational life, however you want to see it, certainly in government, but also in terms of society. Whereas in the Muslim Brotherhood, the most important organization of political Islam, is outlawed as a terrorist organization in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So where does Saudi Arabia send its money, for example? And I'm talking about private and state-owned, state-related investments. Egypt, of the states of this corridor that we're speaking of, has been the most important recipient of Saudi largesse. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot, I hope to be able to show you, of how this is a region of political competition, of kind of low-hanging fruit, opportunistic moments to intervene in financial support, and also in terms of the ability to make footholds in terms of the commercial and military port settings.
Great, thank you, very, very helpful. Peyton, I'm going to turn to you, and if I can put you on the spot a little bit here. We are coming in at a time of a brand new administration with a tremendous number of priorities on its plate, including the impeachment of the former president. And USIP has done a good job of putting together a number of policy recommendations, but I was listening to Tibor Nagy, the former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, talking to BBC yesterday or the day before, and he mentioned, he was asked, could the United States have done more to mitigate this conflict in Ethiopia between the central government and Tigray? And he essentially said no. And what I'm kind of looking for is, given all of the other priorities of the United States right now, what is the reasonable likelihood, given all of the balancing that we have to do, not just elsewhere in the world, but also within the Gulf and within the region, what is the reasonable expectation that we can truly push ourselves into the center of, sort of, as you put it, inoculating the region against extremism?
It's an excellent question. And I think it remains to be seen whether we as a country can muster the political will to do what you've suggested. I mean, with all due respect to Ambassador Nagy, I completely disagree. I think the situation in Ethiopia, there were a number of warning signs and signal flares that preceded the outbreak of conflict in early November, including warnings that were provided by our partners in the Gulf and concerns expressed about the trajectory of events in Ethiopia. And by and large, the United States chose not to heed those warnings and react commensurate with the challenge. So as you rightly point out, though, to some extent, that's water under the bridge. And now the question is whether the Biden administration is going to engage, not just in terms of the escalating conflict in Ethiopia, but situating that in some of the broader dynamics that Karen and I have talked about today. And I must say, I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, I think you quite rightly point out that there are no shortage of global challenges, God knows, but you have seen very informed, I think, very considered statements last week during now Secretary of State Blinken. I think he just got confirmed this afternoon, but during his confirmation hearing last week, this question of the Horn of Africa, of Ethiopia, of the regional ramifications came up on a number of occasions, and clearly Secretary Blinken had some informed views about that. You had seen some comments both from him and from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, about the situation in Ethiopia, about the Horn more broadly, even in the course of the election campaign, prior to the election. So I think there's reason to believe that the administration is planning to give this some attention. I think what we don't know yet is how and what shape and form that will take. And as you said, there's, even if you think about sort of the U.S. Bilateral relationship with any number of these states, whether it's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Karen quite rightly mentions Turkey, of course the Qataris. The big question, and obviously we make a certain argument in the SETI group report for prioritizing this issue of the Horn of Africa in those bilateral relationships. The question is how they do that. I mean, I would conclude by saying that I think, you know, when we first embarked on looking seriously at this Red Sea region 3.5, 4 years ago or so at USIP, we were consulting with a number of folks around Washington, and somebody who had not spent, another scholar who had not spent much time thinking about the Horn of Africa, had just come back from a trip to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And he said, when we were talking, you know, he was really struck by the fact they had a meeting with some very senior Saudi officials. And the only thing they wanted to talk about was not Iran. It wasn't even Yemen, for maybe perhaps obvious reasons. It wasn't Lebanon. They wanted to talk about the Horn of Africa. And I think we do ourselves as the United States a disservice for underappreciating the priorities that some of the Middle Eastern actors actually put on this region. Because, as I said earlier, we tend to think about it in policymaking circles as sort of an afterthought. And truly it's become, I think, anything but.
Great, thanks very much. One of the hallmarks of World Boston is the opportunity for people who are at these events to ask questions rather than having the panelists and the moderator talk amongst themselves. So I'm going to ask Mary and Elise to recognize folks now.
Yes, thank you for an informative discussion. The big elephant in the room here is Iran. I don't understand how any of these initiatives on Red Sea security, particularly at the straits to the Gulf of Aden, can be at all successful without something happening to mitigate the problems between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United States. How would you suggest that the new president of the United States navigate the difficult diplomatic problems to reduce the problem of the insecurity generated by the conflict in Yemen and the potential involvement with people across at the Horn?
Well, Peyton, I think I'll direct that question to you first.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief so we have plenty of time for additional questions. You know, we looked at this a little bit actually in the report, and one of the interesting things, as I'm sure you know, is that Iran actually used to exert more influence in the Horn of Africa than it currently does. There was a much closer Iranian-Sudanese partnership going back a number of years. There were other sort of interactions in the region, and Iranian influence is actually somewhat dissipated. Now, you of course rightly point out the war in Yemen and its broader destabilizing influences. And I think Karen made a point earlier as well that you've seen some of the basing on the western side of the Red Sea by the Emiratis, the Saudis, et cetera, as having been animated by not just the sort of threats they deem the Houthis posing, but the connections between the Houthis and the Iranians and the implications for their own security. And certainly, if there were an escalation of the war in Yemen or you know, the outbreak of a broader war with Iran, I think we could conceivably see a fallout in the Horn of Africa. But I must say, with the exception of some of the maritime sort of activities of the Houthis, which have been unhelpful, certainly in terms of the impediments that has had for trade and commerce, I think the judgment, at least of the study group, was not actually that Iran is the most destabilizing actor currently in this region, right? Now, that's not to say that couldn't change, but it is to say that there are other more destabilizing dynamics that are animating the volatility there. certainly agree with you that obviously some sort of political settlement for the war in Yemen could be tremendously impactful in terms of stabilizing this region. And when you look at arms flows, which we also did in the report, there's substantial evidence of arms flows between Somalia, Yemen, and back and forth to the Red Sea, and there are other examples. So hopefully that responds to your question. Karen, I'm sure, can add more as well.
I won't say too much. I agree with what Peyton had to say, and Sudan is the most interesting case because it's true there was more of an Iranian influence, which the Sudanese themselves, the government kind of pushed them back in favor of a closer tie with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They've been repaid for that kindness, both in terms of financial support, but there's more of a relationship now in terms of the use of Sudanese military personnel inside of the conflict in Yemen. So this, the both sides of the corridor are getting tied and knitted closer and closer together. The Houthis right now, I would actually say, are probably acting more on their own in terms of their recent attacks into, aiming at Riyadh just a couple days ago, and the attempts that they've made on tankers in the Bab el-Mandeb. So I'm myself a bit skeptical of how directly Iran is able to control their actions.
So we'll go to someone Bob, Alexander Beatty at the Pardee School.
So just my question is, what role do you feel that aviation could possibly play in the improvement of relations in the region? Because like with the success of Ethiopian, Emirates, Etihad, Qatar Airways, a lot of the regions that you're talking about at the moment, aviation is kind of one of the key tools that they have to utilize at the moment. And there's been a huge geopolitical significance to that region in terms of flyover rights, which has obviously been in the news a lot since around 2016. So with that kind of cooling of tensions, do you feel that aviation is an arena that could be kind of called upon to help improve relations between these countries?
Karen, can I ask you to take that one first?
Yeah, I mean, Alexander, you're mentioning the dispute, the dispute between the quartet, the Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, and Qatar. And so that dispute, which began in June 2017, has just begun to thaw. And so now Qatari airspace is open and Saudi airspace is open to Qatari flights, et cetera. But we do have this proliferation of national airlines in the Gulf. And in some ways we have more than we need. Now, with a great, large population centers in places like Sudan, Ethiopia, certainly there could be more demand. This year is not it, right? So, in the pandemic, these businesses are not doing well. They're basically being propped up by governments to help them survive. So I don't see a lot of investment in kind of shared or potential mergers going on right now. But 2 years from now, certainly that seems like a very real proposition. And we'll probably see the Gulf airline business expanding more into the budget sector, where creating more hubs and partnerships in the Horn makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so thank you, Alexander. Let's go to Mary Ellen.
Okay, I have a question about the religious conflict in Ethiopia that has seriously gotten completely out of hand at the latter part of 2020. So can we address that with both of our speakers? Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Peyton, I'll ask you to pick that one first, and then we'll go to Karen.
Sure. I mean, the sort of conflict that folks have focused most on, let me put it that way, since November, is the one between the federal government in Addis Ababa and what had been the sort of governing authorities in Tigray, the northern state of one of the northern states of Ethiopia. And it wasn't so much a religious conflict as one animated by a contestation over sort of authority, because the governing elites, as you probably know, and at that time in Tigray, had been the sort of dominant faction within the ruling party that had governed the entire country. The challenge is that sort of rather kind of simplistic way of looking at it, as I just explained it, obscures what I think is a much more profound national political crisis that Ethiopia is facing, and a crisis of authority and a crisis in confidence in the federal system that had basically been the governing model since the end of the communist regime, or since the communist regime was overthrown in the 1990s. When Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power, to much accolades, there were of course a lot of reforms, the release of political prisoners, etc. And there was a lot of discussion about changing the governing model of Ethiopia, but no consensus really built on what would replace the federal system. And that has more or less led to sort of the opening up of the Pandora's box, a symptom of which, albeit a very significant and lethal one, has been the eruption of conflict in Tigray. But there are in some ways equally significant conflicts in other parts of the country. So Oromia, which is the states, they're ethnic states in Ethiopia. And so 60% of Ethiopians are Oromo, and their ethnic state has also had a fairly significant insurgency ongoing for some months now. There's grave instability in Beni Shangul Gumuz, which is where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that the Egyptians are so concerned about is located. There's a number of other unstable pockets. And even prior to the outbreak of the war in November, in 2018, 2019, there were more internally displaced people in Ethiopia than any other country in the continent of Africa, primarily through political violence. And so that's a pretty strong indicator of instability, even as Karen rightly points out, you had the spike of investment representative to some extent, I think, although not entirely, from the sort of accolades poured on Prime Minister Abiy for some of his reforms and for his outreach to Eritrea. But now we're really entering a very concerning period. And, you know, this is a country of 110 million people. I think it is not certainly at this point alarmist to say that it may be heading towards collapse. And I have to say, I mean, that it would be, as we point out actually in the report, the largest state collapse in modern history. I mean, it's 5 times the number of people that lived in pre-war Syria. So, I mean, it's the regional political and security implications, never mind, of course, the humanitarian catastrophe that would unleash, are really, really profound. So the stakes are very, very high, and it relates, I think, as well to Ambassador Loftus's point earlier, which is, you know, how is the United States under the Biden administration going to engage this really, you know, profound challenge? And it certainly remains to be seen.
Yeah, Karen, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think Peyton is much more expert on domestic politics in Ethiopia than I am, but I would just agree. I see it more as this is about contestation for power and authority than it is about religious identity.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go to Jeff Simrot, our distinguished board chair. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, thank you. I have a question for, I think it's for Dr. Young. I was fascinated by the charts that you presented, which seemed to show billions of dollars in expenditures, if you will, but I wasn't quite clear on what they were expenditures for. We're talking about infrastructure, airports, roads, bridges, dams. We're talking about schools, hospitals. What's the money go to?
Thank you. Well, let me clarify about the data and the sourcing. So by capital expenditure, this is a measure of foreign direct investment. And this data comes from a Financial Times company called FDI Markets. And I use their data and then compile it with my own sort of data keeping of how Gulf states deploy financial resources as central bank deposits or commitments of foreign aid, et cetera. But the charts that you saw were just on the FDI measures. So that could be private capital, you know, a private firm based in Saudi Arabia that makes an investment into a manufacturing firm in Ethiopia. Or it could be an investment from a state-owned or state-related entity, if from the Gulf or from the US or from, you know, any of the other cases that I look at. into that recipient country. So this is a measure of capital flows, but FDI data. So it's one snapshot. The aid flows, the direct financial support, those are just as important. But I like to look at these measures of, where money wants to go, even if it might be at the, with a political motive, if it's from a state-related actor or a state-owned actor. Because that tells us a little bit about where opportunity is. And it also tells us about where job creation happens, which I think is really important. As Peyton said, you're looking at 110 million people. That's one of the most important things they need.
All right, thank you. Thank you for taking my question. First, I'd like to compliment our speakers for appearing in a documentary called Red Sea Rivalries, A Conflict of Interest by Foreign Association. It was a really good one, enlightening. And my question is, the two countries that are not talked to much about are Israel and Jordan, who both have access to the Red Sea. Would you please comment about their security challenges? Thank you.
Well, I'll just say this. I do have data for Jordan, and I didn't include it, and I should have. But yes, absolutely. And Israel becoming more and more integrated into the politics and the economics of the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn as well. So I would expect that we're going to see a whole lot more happening in terms of not necessarily security cooperation, but perhaps defense sales, shared technology, defense technology. I don't know, Peyton, if you want to say more on in terms of the U.S. positioning and if that was part of your report, that might be important to include as well.
Sure. I mean, it's a really important question, and I think particularly in the sort of aftermath of the Abraham Accords, right? And you've seen, for example, Sudan associate itself with them, maybe cautiously, but nonetheless. And I think it's also a question that that certainly the Biden administration will have to address. And I mean, there have been some statements about sort of continuing, being supportive of the Abraham Accords, but wondering and wanting to look, more thoroughly at what some of the deals, what constituted some of the deals. And I think certainly in the Sudan case, that is necessary and important to sort of be able to take in, to adequately assess the impact. I mean, having said that, it does seem to be, even in the sort of, now that President Trump has left office, it does seem to actually be in some ways marching a bit forward. I mean, just this week, the head of Mossad visited, supposedly in a fairly public visit, Khartoum. So, I mean, it's a very interesting question. And I think, as Karen said, you are seeing more overt diplomatic and security engagement by Israel in this space. There had been long-standing, much more covert engagement by the Israelis. There was, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, even when we think about maybe the last question about Ethiopia, Israel has long had a very close security partnership, both with Ethiopia and with Eritrea, which I think is also interesting when you think about some of the dynamics I mentioned earlier in terms of the shifting sort of polarity between Egypt and Ethiopia and Eritrea, never mind a number of other states. So it is, I'm maybe not giving you a firm answer, but I think you're raising the right question, which is that it's an important dynamic. I think Jordan is less an economic player, as certainly Karen can speak to more authoritatively than I can. I think it's less sort of a political and security actor, at least assertively, compared to some of the other states. But I think the sort of Israeli engagement is something to watch, and something to watch very much, I think, in the context of the war in Ethiopia as well, and sort of how Jerusalem calculates around what that means, what the destabilization of the region means for its own interests, just as Egypt and others are.
So go right ahead.
Okay, thank you for finally enabling me to participate. My question had to do with, for the past year, the whole world has been consumed by COVID and a pandemic. So I'm just curious as to how it's affected the Red Sea states. And given the fact that COVID vaccines have been developed by Western powers, I'm wondering if they could use those vaccines to leverage some common sense into the region for cooperation.
I would just say China beat us to the game on that one. Where there are vaccine cooperation agreements throughout the Arabian Peninsula, but also sub-Saharan Africa, it's really China is there and we're not.
And I also say that traditionally the United States has not used health aid as leverage to get other countries to do what we want them to do. We have always sequestered that off. We find it very difficult to say that we're not going to be providing life-saving assistance unless you do what we want you to do.
I mean, I would just
Excuse
add
me,
that
I didn't mean it as in a coercive fashion. I meant it in a cooperative fashion.
I mean, it's obviously also a really critical question. I think when you look at least on the Horn side of the Red Sea, I mean, clearly COVID has had a devastating impact in Yemen, for example. I think the health impact, largely because the ability to measure it is not, the capacities are not quite as, are not there as they are in some of the more industrialized parts of the world. But in the last month or so, it's gotten seemingly exponentially worse, even with inadequate data in terms of the human cost. And that has, I think, certainly reverberations across these societies. You have seen, and Ethiopia again is I think a good example of this. I mean, they're one of the proximate causes of the outbreak of the war in November was actually the postponement of elections in Ethiopia that were meant to be held and in fact required under the constitution to be held in August. And they were postponed in some ways legitimately because of the challenges posed to, I mean, they were a little bit behind schedule anyway, but doing the census and various other things, some of the challenges posed by the pandemic, the logistical challenges. But the political fallout has been amidst accusations that they were postponed in order for the prime minister to use the sort of excuse of COVID to consolidate his own power. So irrespective of, whichever is more factually accurate, the fact of the matter is it has had, fairly significant political and by extension security consequence in Ethiopia. To some extent, Sudan also, obviously, as we've talked about, in a delicate sort of state of its own transition. It's challenging when you have a fragile transitional government in place and ministers are getting COVID and, on top of everything else, they're supposed to be responding to a health emergency without any capacity to do so. And then as I think Karen pointed out, the Sudanese have really looked to the West for support for this sort of rather rare moment for democracy and not gotten a lot of it, frankly. Either preceding the pandemic or certainly, since then, given just the scope and scale of the, what the COVID-19 virus has done to the Sudanese economy, which was already in very desperate straits.
Okay, thank you very much. Friends, I am very sorry to say, I think we've run out of time. This is just a fantastic panel. I think it's a classic World Affairs Council panel because we're looking at long-term dynamics and of the moment changes. Really, really appreciate the insights from our speakers. Peyton Knopf, Karen Young, and Bob Loftus, thank you all very much. And everybody have a great night.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody.